Hey guys, and welcome back to Permitted with Conditions. As always, I'm Sam the intern, and now let's dive into part 4 of our interview with Joe Tovar. Yeah, so middle housing, right, was one of the hot
Yeah,
topics, after being adopted by the legislature in 2023. And you recently finished working with the Department of Commerce in a capacity to help them kind of gear up to provide technical assistance to cities. Do you see the local adoption process going smoothly, or do you think there's some challenges that still lie ahead?
there are challenges that still lie ahead. One of the things the legislature did when they adopted the middle housing bill, House Bill 1110, was to say, we want Commerce to work to develop a model middle housing ordinance. Spent a lot of resources while I was there and even after I left working for Commerce, trying to detail what could a model ordinance look like. My understanding is the model ordinance is going to be issued in about a week or two, so we'll be able to look at that, see what they make of it. The legislature has said, here's a model, it's only a model, unless you don't adopt your own middle housing ordinance by the middle of 2025. And here I'm talking about the four-county region with the 82 cities in this four-county region. So you've got a choice here. You can adopt the model whole cloth, the way it reads, or you can adopt your own version. But this is, I think, the first time the legislature has said, this is what you're going to do. I mean, they really have a very different attitude towards the balance between what the state expectation is and what the local government response is going to be based on some of these bills that they've adopted. And I'll talk about them in just a minute. But back to your original question, is it going smoothly? It's too early to know how smoothly it's going to go. Some people are still, I should say some city people I've spoken with have not let go of the fact they don't like the bill. They don't like the mandate. They don't like being told, that we have to do this. My advice to them is to say, I respect your opinion. You expressed your opinion to the legislature. This is now the law. So the time to complain about the law not being fair or right or productive is past. Now you've got the law you must comply with. The best thing you should be focusing on is how do we do this in a way that is the most respectful to our circumstance, our priorities, what's important to us here. Not everybody has to adopt the model ordinance. I think there's a great opportunity for people to adopt what I'm calling variations or variants on the middle to still, they would still need to be able to satisfy the requirements of 1110, not codified in the GMA as a requirement. But I think there's a lot of room for them to take bits and pieces of what might be in that model ordinance, maybe add other pieces that they want to do differently based on what others have done other places. So I think this is one of the things I think is a good example of what I'm calling what the legislature is now doing that's different. I'm going to transition now to this slide, which is how and why did the legislature make the reforms they've made, what I'm calling GMA 2.0, which is not just 1110, but it's also the accessory dwelling unit bill, 1337, the design review bill, 1293, and for that matter, the housing element and housing goal amendments that were made 2 years ago in House Bill 1220. In each of these cases, these bills were adopted by legislators, many of whom are former city elected officials. Either the sponsors of the bills were elected officials from Olympia, Kirkland, Shoreline, Cordis, people who know what it means to be a local elected official. They understand the importance and the challenges of local elected officials. And yet they needed to say, we need to do this. We need to do many of the things like the middle housing bill. And all the things I'm now going to show you, I think all flow from the fact that these are elected officials who have an understanding of what you can and can't expect local elected officials to do without some kind of guidance, some kind of direction from the state. So a good example here is that recent legislation like 1110 directly speaks to requirements that are to be made to the land use regulations, not to the comprehensive plans. Now, there are other things that still, like 1220, gives direction to the comprehensive plan, but for the first 25 years or so of the GMA, the predisposition of the legislature was largely to say, put it in the plan, understanding that, well, then after it's in your plan, you have a duty to implement your plan and relying on local governments then to adopt regulations to implement their plan. Now, that's a duty under 040. 040 says your regulations must be consistent with and implement what the comprehensive plan says. Well, again, I'm a planner. I believe in plans. I think comprehensive plans are great and good things that should be done. But now the legislature is saying that's all well and good. There are cases, though, where we need to say to local governments, you must amend your land use regulations specifically. And that's what some of these bills do. 1110 does it, 1337 does it, 1293 does it. That's new. And that's part of another theme here, which is the legislature has begun to adjust the balance between local control and a compelling state interest. Housing is a compelling state interest. Housing climate crises are compelling state interests. The legislature has said local control is important for many things, But in some things, there's a compelling state interest that can only be served if we give direction that is more than people have been expecting for the first 30 years of the GMA. It's a good example of reform is the legislature has begun to say, we're going to exempt from SEPA lots of actions that otherwise would have been subject to environmental checklists, environmental appeals, environmental impact statements, a lot of uncertainty, time and expense and delay. So by exempting things from SEPA, the legislature is clearly saying, we're not saying SEPA is not relevant for some things, but there's some things where it really just is either redundant or actually obstructs the achieving important policy goals, like more housing. Finally, this is a reference to the roadmap process, the Rockwell South Center process. I think legislation that results from a collaborative stakeholder process has been more successful than legislation that has served as solitary or a narrow interest. Best example, back to I mentioned in 2016, 70 bills introduced by narrow interest, they all went down. Last couple of years, all these bills, these are just 4 or 5 of them. There are many other bills, another 5 or 6 bills that have passed in what I'm calling the GMA 2.0 era are the result of this collaborative process. People taking the time to listen to each other, to identify different ideas, to see is there some kind of common ground or sweet spot in agreement that can be achieved by taking the time through a collaborative process to figure out what is better than what we all have right now. Is it just, I'm going to torpedo your bill, you're going to torpedo my bill, nobody's happy, there's no change, as opposed to let's work together. People need to understand that collaborate means work together. And finally, the legislature has dramatically increased the amount of money they're giving to cities and counties to do the planning required by the GMA. When the GMA started back in 1990, the first biennium, I think there were something like $16 million allocated for grants to cities and counties to do this work. That tapered off after 5 or 6 years to almost nothing. Recently, though, the last session or two, the legislature has really stepped up. And depending on which kind of grant process you're talking about, they're giving tens of millions of dollars now to cities and counties to do everything from plan updates to the regulations update to the middle housing grants. I heard just yesterday, in addition to the 28 cities that had grants to do the middle housing work in this region, there now are 70 more grants that have been given to cities in other parts of the state, including some cities that aren't even in fully planning counties, like Pullman, who are saying, or another good example, White Salmon, Skamania County. They're saying, hey, we have a housing crisis. We're doing this not because 1110 applies to us. We have a housing crisis. So we're really interested in middle housing. State, can you give us some funds to help figure out how we're going to do this? So I think the state legislature and Commerce, especially as the people who've been responsible for carrying out some of these legislative directions to share information, guidance, and money, are stepping up and saying, how do we do a better job of helping things work? Part of the answer is back to funding to do the planning. Now, funding to do the infrastructure is a whole nother subject, bigger ticket item. And I think we'll be hearing more about that in the future. But these are the things I think that are the DNA of what's been happening for the last couple of years. And when legislative bodies of cities and counties think about what should we be doing, I think it really is in their interest to consider where this came from and what is the legislature expecting and hoping for them to do.
Yeah, I've kind of been fascinated the last couple of years with the level of detail of the legislation. I think, one of the other ones, Bill, you didn't mention that came out here in the last couple of years was the UGA swap bill, which really, I think, is, to me, a profound step for the legislature because, we've always looked at, or at least most people have looked at urban growth boundaries as being fairly rigid. But I think, the legislature really got something right in that UGA swap bill by basically saying, if you have areas in your urban growth boundary that have lots of critical areas that are in river floodplains, aren't really suitable for development, the goal is to have development be in an urban growth boundary. So if you could swap that stuff that shouldn't be in an urban growth boundary from day one for an area that could be better serviceable and actually accommodate the right infrastructure and things, that's okay to do. And so I know, last year they did I think it was last year was the bill to go ahead and allow for the net zero swap, but to do so at periodic updates, which is the, once every 10-year update to the comp plan. But then now you're seeing legislation this session that's allowing, potentially for the net zero swap to happen any time that the annual comp plan updates are kind of coming through for consideration. And I think that's just a way of, I think it's an opportunity to give a good tool to jurisdictions, to counties to basically say, hey, a lot of these UGAs have been pretty static over time, and maybe they haven't been utilized in the ways we thought they would 30 years ago. Here's your opportunity to make some technical adjustments and fix some of those early mistakes. And so I mean, with how the legislature's approached this, it's in my sense, it's given some new energy to growth management, to kind of re-explore some things from the foundation up, beyond just making some of the other adjustments that are being made. We obviously had a little kind of warm up call here last week when we were talking about doing this podcast. I know you mentioned that you were going to be teaching a class soon up at Western Washington University, which is my alma mater. When speaking to some of those future planners, it's the upcoming class of folks that we're going to entrust to carry forward the visions of our communities. What are a couple of the top kind of planning issues that you see those students are going to most likely have to tackle in their careers, and what's some of your guidance as far as how they should approach the evolution of growth management, and what's that going to mean for them?
I've given a lot of thought to this, and there's several ways to try to answer this question. One is that all the things that are crises right now won't be over anytime soon. We'll still be dealing with housing and transportation and climate resilience and natural hazards. Those are going to be perpetual issues that will require attacking. A lot of these things like, let's say, affordable housing, homelessness, traffic congestion, I don't think in the abstract are entirely solvable. I don't think we can define success as we've solved it. There's no more congestion. There's no more homelessness. There's no more environmental consequence for salmon and orca. I would caution them against sort of being fatalistic about the fact that we cannot as a society ever completely solve some of these problems. They're wicked, intractable problems. On the other hand, that doesn't mean you stop attacking them. I think you continue to do what you can do to make things better, to make things more efficient, more effective, again, against the backdrop of always understanding. These are controversial issues. Planning is controversy. When one of my professors years ago said the planning is basically an exercise in allocation of pain and benefit. So don't expect people not to be very outspoken in what they think about the alternatives that you're considering, whether it's a transportation plan or an environmental regulation or whatever it might be. So I guess I would caution them against thinking that these are entirely solvable. They will be with us for many years. The other thing I would advise them is to, in terms of the kind of skills they will need to build as students and in their careers, I would divide these sort of two categories. One are soft skills, the other one are hard skills. By hard skills, I mean things like, quantitative methods, GIS skills, economic forecasts, things that have some kind of a technical, let's say, a discipline, a part of making policy, making choices, making recommendations for choices. So those are hard skills that I think people have to be building into their education. The soft skills, I think, are just as important, though, because inevitably what you're doing is you're trying to work with people. That's who you're working for if you're a planner. You're working not just for the elected officials of your council, the planning commission, your other staff members of other departments in your organization. You're working for the community. You're working for the development community. You're working for the neighborhoods. You're working for everyone. I mean, the ethical duty of a planner is to serve the broad public interest, which means everyone. So you're going to be hearing from everybody. You need to be having good communication skills with everybody. One thing I've learned, and I would advise students to keep in mind, is that you're not going to get agreement with everybody, with each other. And so you're not going to get agreement with what individual people might say about what the best policy choice might be for your community. But people really need to be listened to. People need to be acknowledged. I found, again, in my experience, people are more interested in being acknowledged, heard and acknowledged, than they are in being agreed with. Now, being agreed with is important to them too. And, advising people on how to advocate for their own interests, that's another soft skill. I think it's a good one to develop. To let people know, here's the policy. It's not my policy. It's the policy adopted by my elected officials, or the regulation adopted by my elected officials, my city, my county, my state elected officials. I'm here to basically carry out what they've said they want to have happen. And if there's a way to change those policies, I can advise you on how that might happen. But for the time being, I'm here to administer the rules that have been adopted by your elected officials. So soft skills include listening. Soft skills include advising as appropriate. Certainly acknowledging to people that you're hearing what they're saying and telling them. Getting to yeses was a popular phase 15 or 20 years ago. Everybody was interested in organizational theory and how to get to yes. Well, if you get to yes, that's great. But if you have to get to no, the sooner you get to no and explaining why the answer might be no, at least what the rules allow or not allow, or what you might or might feel like you can recommend to a commission or a council, I think people undervalue. In fact, I've had several developers over the years, and when I was in local government, tell me, look, just tell me what I can do. The answer is no. That has value. I need to know that. That's part of my pro forma of, do I really want to make an investment decision to build this project in this part of your city or not? So don't think the answer is always, you've got to get to yes no matter what, because sometimes in trying to get to yes, what you're doing is taking people along a long, twisting, winding primrose path that goes off a cliff after many months and many dollars. So if it's possible to be candid and honest about what you think the prospects of getting to yes are, I'd suggest find a way to do that respectfully, but clearly.
That's a great point. I have had, several times in my career where we've worked on projects, and it would have been really helpful to get stronger feedback from the jurisdiction that something just wasn't going to work before, our clients, spent considerable sums of money trying to move a project forward that really didn't have a life to it. And so where you can, be candid about that early on is super important, because, it's the relationships that you create. Because when you look at whether it's housing or it's a commercial project or something of that nature, when you're in that planner role, you may not think of yourself as an economic developer, but you are an economic developer in sense of your community. And people are weighing the information that you're providing and making investment decisions in your community. And so, to the extent that, the interactions can help pull them in the direction of, this is the vision that we've planned. Here's what we're trying to accomplish. And, making sure that those things line up with investment, so that, in my mind, you don't want somebody to come in and propose something and have that not quite go right, and then they're not as interested in your community for potential investments, because lost opportunities are never good. But I think that to me always stands out about the planning process is it's so integral to economic development, especially in Washington State and our region, that to me is a key part of making sure that as you're doing that communication and collaboration between the public sector and the private sector, that what you said, that sometimes there is a way to get to yes, and there's a process to work through to get there. But if the obvious is that it's not going to be able to get to yes, knowing that earlier in the process is advantageous, because it allows somebody to take those resources and maybe redirect them into something else in that same community, or go find another community where the project does make sense.
Yeah, so following up on the previous question, in your opinion, if you look into the future, say 20 so years, what do you think might have changed about the GMA, and what do you think might have changed about how we plan?
Well, I think it's going to be an ongoing evolution. I don't think the GMA is static. I don't think comprehensive plans are static. Plans and regulations live in three-ring binders for a reason. Change happens. Priorities change. Circumstances change. So I think thinking about the future is always kind of a roll of the dice. One trend I think that I see is greater engagement with tribal nations in the state of Washington. This is something that was one of the first things talked about in the Ruckelshaus House Center final report. Need to find a way to better engage with tribal governments. We even heard this from many county people at the time. We need to find a better way, more productive way to engage with tribal governments. Discussed in Roadmap 2, it manifested in Roadmap 3 in House Bill 1717, which now creates the opportunity for a participating tribe, if they wish to, take part in working with the city and a county on comprehensive plans, as well as in regional policies, meaning countywide planning policies. So example, David made mention of the Urban Growth Area Boundary Revision Bill that passed last year, or a year or two ago. It's being discussed again this year. And one of the things that is going to be important is that now that tribes have been given the invitation by House Bill 1717 to engage in regional policymaking, I see more of that happening. It's just started to begin right now. It's an ongoing challenge, since tribes have some of the same staffing challenges that local governments have. But over time, I think the cooperation and partnership between county, cities, and tribes, and some state agencies, is going to be part of what will be different over time. I think will be different. I'm hoping it will be different. Tribes have a strong interest and have resources and knowledge to share, which I think many of them are eager to do. There are some issues where they won't agree with what a city or a county thinks should be happening. They have treaty rights. They're sovereign entities. If they want to go to federal court to pursue their interests, their treaty rights, they can. They're not letting go of that. They're not surrendering that, but collaborating and working with counties and cities on plans, regulations, projects. So I think that's an opportunity and a likely trend I see going on into the future. If I'm looking out through my crystal ball, I see better engagement, more productive work collaboratively with tribes. Related to that, but not exclusively tribes, I also think greater attention will be paid to ecosystems at a regional scale. We talked earlier about regionalism is one of the hallmarks, again, of one of the recommendations and guidances in the roadmap process. We have Central Puget Sound region, which has a very different circumstance than other parts of the state. A lot of work, a lot of time, a lot of collaboration, efforts already gone into trying to recover the resource of Central Puget Sound. I saw just the other day that there's a new calf born to JPOD. That's a healthy sign. But long term, recovering entirely or as much as possible populations of salmon, orca, and other aquatic life in Puget Sound will be a continuing focus. And I'm hoping that reform to how local governments are expected to deal with land use as it affects water quality and the health of Puget Sound is another focus I see. Again, I'm hopeful. I'm thinking as tribes become more engaged, as people become more interested in water quality and quality of life, being as important as providing housing and transportation options for people, I think that'll continue to be a focus, hopefully for local governments as well as regional governments, and I would think the state legislature.
Yeah, that's great. The collaboration part to me is key, at the regional level in partnerships, because I think so often we don't have to be in silos. We don't have to go it alone. I've seen a number of very successful projects over the last few years where, it involves the tribes, the city, private developers, and others working together in order to be, order to build projects, create infrastructure, and do things that are real improvements to communities. Joe, I want to thank you today for being with us. Really appreciate that. I know we've kind of asked a number of questions here, but to the extent that we haven't asked a question about something that you think is significant relative to growth management or just current planning, I wanted to give you an opportunity to share with listeners something that maybe we've missed.
Well, I appreciate that invitation. I think I've emptied quite a few buckets here over the past hour. I do think that what I'd like to express maybe as a closing thought is that everybody has a right to be engaged in making and implementing policy. It's not just the work of state legislatures, counties and cities, staff people. It's private sector, meaning the people who actually build much of this. It's primarily the private sector that's doing this. So they have a role, an ongoing important role in planning and implementing what's going on in the state in the future. I guess likewise, individual citizens, I'm hoping, would become more knowledgeable about. We were talking earlier about how to engage the public in a greater degree in plan making. I'm hoping that more effort can be given to outreach to the public, existing members of communities, as well as the next generation. I think this is something that can and should be taught in high schools as part of civics, that people should understand. How did that Costco get built at the corner of X and Y? What's going to happen if my elderly parents need to move out of their house and want to live somewhere? I mean, how to relate this overall policy framework of planning and development and management to individual people, I think, is going to be an important focus. And that may be the work of local governments. It may be the work of the universities. Universities have, I think, an opportunity here to do some of that acclimation, some of that education, some of that outreach to the communities that they serve. So I'm hoping that, again, collaboration is sort of the key word here we've been using. I think collaboration with people at an individual and community-wide scale is going to be important. And finding ways to do that, I think, is something that's a very worthwhile effort.
Excellent. Well, once again, thank you so much for your time. We really value the time that you've given us and a lot of great insight into the history of growth management and what's going on in growth management today and how that relates to folks. And I will turn it over to you, Sam, to kind of close this out here today.
Thank you.
All right. Well, Joe, thanks again for joining us. And for those of you listening at home, thank you for downloading this episode of Permitted with Conditions. Make sure you've obtained the right permits to receive future episodes by subscribing to Substack, Spotify, or Apple Podcast. And follow us on social media for news and updates. That's all for today's episode. Take care, and until next time.